Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2013 Carolina Game Summit. We now have the keynote speaker for you, Mr. David Sears. He is going to speak about the truth about power and politics in the game industry. He is from SOF Studios. Please welcome David Sears.
Also, can somebody throw me a bottle of water, maybe? No? No water. There's a dude with water. All right, so let's get started. So before I begin, I should say that I've been in the games industry for 22 years, and I was making games as a hobbyist before I was actually a professional. So what I'm talking about today comes largely from personal experience, but a lot of it is through the interaction of the people I interviewed for this presentation, a lot of industry professionals who have as many years or longer in the industry than I do. I should also give you some caveats. If you're familiar with the Christian Bible, you will note that there is a second allegorical story contained within this presentation. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, the images remain delightfully violent and apocalyptic. You should also know that I am not a Satanist. If you're unfamiliar with the Marquis de Sade and Machiavelli, they're going to seem like old friends to you by the time I'm done. I've slightly modernized their language to be easier to follow in modern audiences. But the content of their quotations remains exactly the same as I found it when I read it. If you're offended by occasional vulgarity or nudity in classical art, you might want to leave, which would leave no one here. But if you're okay with that, and I'm going to swear occasionally too, and you can swear along with me, then we're going to get along just fine. And finally, the names of the clueless and the sadistic, the naive and eternally hopeful people that I've spoken with or interacted with have all been, the names have been changed, but their stories remain entirely true, if slightly unbelievable. And I should also say that I really do not hate all producers in the games industry, but it can be really easy to believe that from some of the things I'm going to say today. This presentation is in part a look at how I learned to understand why things happen the way they happen very, very often in the games industry over the course of my career. The lessons about power and politics, though, are universal. And I think it's extremely troubling that we see these problems most prominently in the arts and the industry that arises around the creative arts. But I can say that if you learn to recognize bad behaviors, you can develop strategies to deal with them. And as game developers, if we do not learn to recognize and respond to these bad behaviors, the very unpleasant future that I portray in this presentation may come to pass. So it's the future, and I imagine that I'm on my deathbed. I've lived a very long life, and if measured by my career, I have had some notable successes. Many, many people have profited from my labors, and all of them more so than myself. While I can say that I have achieved much, I feel that I could have achieved a lot more. As I reflect on the decades I spent working in places where I managed to create something great in spite of the obstacles put in my path, and all the friends I made, lifelong friends made in what was, for all intents and purposes, a war to do our jobs to the best of our abilities, I realize that I have fallen short. So wrapped up in my desire to entertain, I failed to instruct. So surely my experiences and those of my colleagues should have been shared so that history didn't need to repeat itself, so that people could go about their business and focus on their passion, which was to make great games. I knew that often when I could not tolerate the manipulation and the power plays and the obliviousness I routinely experienced in major studios, and I would resign from the company, the project would be canceled or the studio would even shut down. So many times after I left, the worst people in those companies, in those organizations, were found out and either forced out of the company or terminated. And I wondered, could I have held on a little longer or helped to give those people the push out the door that they deserved? In the future, so few people actually make games. Or I should say, so few people make anything new today. Who really wants to work in an industry with a reputation for abuse? The film industry died out a long time ago for the very same reasons. Most creative work today in the future is done by artificial personalities, many of those patterned after notable figures from history. Lately, I've been listening to a talk show. Oh, thank you. I've been listening to a talk show, one that's hosted by recreations of the Marquis de Sade and Niccolo Machiavelli. They argue constantly, and I think it's because they are really a lot alike. And so, being ancient and realizing that I have so little time left, I call into the show. The perspective of these two is resonant with me. And in particular, I think Machiavelli has a lot to answer for. In fact, I think the way I feel is entirely his fault. I'm 92 years old, and I still have no answers. I'm not angry anymore, but I refuse to move on without at least asking some questions. While I'm sitting in the call queue, I recall an opportunity I once had to speak at a games conference. The theme of the conference was the future. I had decided to back out because the amount of work was way too daunting, and I was busy with a new job. The present required my full attention. Same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. No one knew this better than Niccolo Machiavelli. And sitting there, I realized that I know that pretty well too. I remember a line from Machiavelli's The Prince. He who diligently examines the past events easily foresees future ones and can apply to them the remedies used by the ancients, or at least devise new ones because of similarity of events. There are courses of action that should not be taken because simply they are bad ideas and often bring us to catastrophic consequences. We've all heard this advice many times, but I'm haunted by something else Machiavelli said in the Discourses. While The Prince has been studied deeply and his teachings put into practice by managers all over the world, the insights of his other works were neglected or purposefully ignored. So consider this. As soon as tyranny is established over a free community, the first evil that results is that such cities no longer go forward or increase in power or riches, but in most instances, in fact, always, they go backwards. A city bent on greatness must remain free of political servitude, whether imposed internally by a tyrant or externally by an imperial power. So city-states, the city-states Machiavelli was talking about, are analogous to development teams, and the tyrants are analogous to those put in power who do not deserve to be there. These people who abuse the power they are given, or who simply have agendas that do not match those of the creative teams they are there to lead. Cities only grow enormously in a short time and acquire greatness if the people are in control of them. Because as Machiavelli goes on to say, it is not individual good but common good that makes cities great. Under a prince, the opposite happens, for what benefits him usually injures the city, and what benefits the city injures him. And he's talking about the good princes. I'm sure everyone here has known a few bad ones. Keep in mind that in our industry, in the games industry, the princes are most often called producers. Machiavelli wrote so much that is undeniably true, I wonder how many warnings he set forth for the would-be producer princes of the modern world, and how much advice applies directly to creatives who have never bothered to read a single word of a book on management, let alone the original writings of Machiavelli. So who was this guy who not only distilled thousands of years of history into a handbook for aspiring princes, but who wrote the lessons in such a way that they became a self-perpetuating arsenal of weaponry that evolves and adapts with almost every modern enterprise? I think this sums up what motivated Machiavelli. It is customary for those who seek a prince's favor to present themselves before him such things of theirs as they themselves most value. I have found among my possessions none that I prize so and esteem so as a knowledge of the actions of great men. Machiavelli wrote this prince book to curry favor from the Medici in hopes of obtaining a government post. He was bored out of his mind back on his farm, spending his exile scribbling away. Machiavelli obviously was a suck-up, and look what he started. But he understood and advised the princes of his day to be goal setters, to set reachable objectives, and to let nothing stand in the way of achieving those objectives, which is good advice to all of us, producer princes and creatives alike. But Machiavelli was not the only writer who understood the motivations of humanity and the secret or not so secret games that we play to grow and exercise our power over one another. The Marquis de Sade stands out as a remarkably insightful observer of the human condition, and like Machiavelli, his books were banned for many years. There must be something in them that we are not supposed to know. Sade did not invent sadism. This deviation has been known virtually from the dawn of civilization, and sadistic acts are described in literary accounts dating back to Petronius and Sozomen. However, Sade most certainly was the first writer to describe sadism as a sexual enterprise, and this is the reason for his importance to psychiatry and behavioral sciences. But he pioneered much more. Sade has articulated, usually for the first time anywhere, some of the 20th century's most thought about thoughts. A quarter of a century before Charles Darwin's birth, he discussed nature in evolutionary terms. Half a century before Havelock Ellis, he produced a volume of sexual pathology. A century before Freud, he postulated the existence of an unconscious mind. A century and a half before Margaret Mead, he probed sexual mores anthropologically and warned of the necessity of population control. Some of his political views have been put into practice by such diverse figures as Fidel Castro, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and of course, this guy, Adolf Hitler. Clearly, Sade was writing about something that affected many people deeply and resonantly, for better or for worse. Sade spent 27 years in 11 different prisons and one insane asylum. And reading about Sade made me wonder, are producers afraid that creatives will simply have orgies 24 hours a day if they're not governed completely? Sade, who is a poster child for excess, proves otherwise. His output was prodigious. This guy was unstoppable. It didn't matter whether he was in an asylum or a prison. He kept writing. So you might argue that being in prison was in some way similar to working on a development team that's tightly controlled by a producer prince. The difference being you were paid to follow the direction of a producer. Sade was paid nothing. From his cell at the Charenton Asylum, which was the nut house in Paris during the Revolution, Sade had a clear view of the guillotine, which had been moved from the Place de la Concorde because of public complaints about the smell of blood. The executed were buried in tens of thousands on the grounds of the sanatorium. Sade watched this bloody slaughter day after day and declared in correspondence that it affected him greatly. Against the backdrop of these horrific events in Sade's own life, the cruelties of his fictions take on highly ironic character, to which I say Sade wrote from frustration on not being able to directly experience the liberty of expression that he illustrates in his books. It's likely that Sade would have produced entirely different works and reached a far larger audience if he had not been imprisoned. And I could say the same about some game development teams. So I say the same holds true for creatives who watch team members come and go based on the whims of a producer prince who see their work undermined and destroyed by bad decisions at an executive level, and whose own confidence and creative edge is eroded by cavalier princely behavior. Thinking back on all the research I did for that presentation I didn't give, I recall that the people I most wanted to address, what I hoped was a small subset of people working in the games industry at large, broke down this way. So good producers and good creatives make up about 50% of the game development population, and I've been fortunate to know and work with many good groups such as these. Good producers and bad creatives, creatives who don't know what they're doing, probably about 15% of the industry. Bad producers and bad creatives, Again, about 15% of the industry. These people are hopeless, and they're doomed. And bad producer, good creatives, which seems to happen about 20% of the time and is probably the most tragic situation to find yourself in as a creative developer. If you're wondering where I got these numbers, I made them up. It's for the purposes of having a chart, but it does feel that way after interviewing the people I spoke with for this presentation. It does feel about like this. Each of these categories would really require a presentation on its own, but I'm just looking at bad producers, good creatives. So I knew at the time that there were a lot of unhappy people working in the games industry when I was still young, but I didn't know just how many, or at least not how many among the managers or the producers. According to Marilyn Haight in her book, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Boss, in a survey of 900 managers when asked if you did not need to work for economic reasons, would you want to keep the job you have, 99.78% said no. When asked if they would work doing something else, 100% said they would. They would keep working. These managers said managing people was unfulfilling and boring. Why were they working in their current position? For better pay, benefits, privileges, and status. These were the only reasons for taking a management job. When managers feel this way, they don't do any of the things that you see on the screen, but they do spend the majority of their time building their power base. These are blatant refusals to accept the responsibility of managers to manage people. Managers are paid to minimize human error, not to increase its chance of occurring. And oddly, I doubt that a potential producer says in a job interview, the first thing I'm going to do is create a climate of fear, oppression, and confusion. But that's exactly what a bad producer does. And it's very easy to do with a team of sensitive creatives. And because they have not engaged their team from a humane perspective, these managers have very little remorse about making decisions that negatively affect their teams. And I say humane here because, rather than human, because what these producers are doing is very human, according to both Sade and Machiavelli. And this behavior is exactly what Machiavelli has shown works well for the management of the city-state and the preservation of power for the prince. Most disturbing, though, is that after all the damage is done to a team, bad producers may have a moment of epiphany, and I've certainly lived through more than a few moments like those. I've been approached by producers to whom I've given advice and warnings about the destruction of team morale or obvious mistakes in direction, and after making complete train wrecks out of the project, they asked me, what can we do to get people to move on? What can we do to get people to stop complaining? And I just have to shake my head and say nothing. They've already staged their inquisitions, burned well-meaning developers at the stake, and through consistent micromanagement, capricious, unmotivated decisions, and more than a few witch hunts, extinguished the creative spark that drives game developers to do great work. And I have to laugh because you don't just bounce back from an inquisition. Over the years, I've worked with good producers and bad, and at times been a good creative leader and a bad creative leader. I hope that I've learned my lessons well and never swing back to the bad behavior of my early days in the industry. One thing I learned is that when good producers and good creatives form a partnership, the producer clears the path for the creative team and never, ever imposes creative control. The creative team works with the producer to innovate and entertain within their budget. The project runs really smoothly, and the game has the best chance for success. This is like fire and water or shadow and light. But when the balance is off, this often explains why the game that you've been expecting for years never comes out, or why your favorite game designer moves on from a game company under mysterious circumstances. So something that sounds so simple was always really, really elusive. And I wondered what the reasons were, because this paradigm, within this paradigm, this balance, everyone wins. I didn't realize that it's not about everyone winning. When you read Machiavelli, it becomes really, really obvious. When a good creative leader is partnered with a bad producer prince, they are at war from the beginning of their relationship, even if the creative person doesn't know it. The producer prince's number one job is to ensure that he wins the war. Or maybe it's more obvious in this film. You can say what you want about Prometheus, but I can find at least two moments of sublime genius here. If you haven't seen the film, I'm sure everyone's seen it by now, But if you haven't, don't worry. I won't reveal the ending, but I do need to set it up a bit by saying the crew of the spaceship has just woken from hypersleep on a far-off world. The doctors have discovered cave paintings back on Earth that indicated the location of this planet. It might be the origin of humanity. And the doctors have this crazy idea that they should go to this planet and have an adventure. But before the doctors can begin exploration on the planet, they must meet the person who represents the company that funded the expedition. As we watch this clip, just as a thought experiment, I want you to substitute the word producer whenever you hear the words Miss Vickers. And if you hear the word doctors, substitute game designer. Okay? So Miss Vickers, producer, doctors, game designers.
Doctors, Miss Vickers would like to have a quick word before the adventure begins.
Wow, nice place.
It's actually a separate module with its own self-contained life support. Air, food, anything Miss Vickers would need to survive a hostile environment.
Okay, so she lives on a lifeboat.
Yes, I do. I like to minimize risk. David, why don't you make the doctors a drink? I think there might be some confusion about our relationship. Wayland found you impressive enough to fund this mission, but I'm fairly certain your engineers are nothing but scribblings of savages living in dirty little caves. But let's say I'm wrong, and you do find these beings down there. You won't engage them. You won't talk to them. You will do nothing but report back to me.
Miss Vickers, is there an agenda that you're not telling us about?
My company paid $1 trillion to find this place and to bring you here. Had you raised the monies yourself, Mr. Holloway, we'd happily be pursuing your agenda. But you didn't. And that makes you an employee.
If we can't make contact, why did you even bring us here?
Wayland was a superstitious man. He wanted a true believer on board. Cheers.
Bitch. And so there it is, 1,000,000 light years from home, and the power paradigm between people is exactly the same. Of course, in Miss Vickers' defense, the doctors or game designers were total morons and in a very practical sense. Not only did they blunder into every possible dangerous scenario, they appeared to revel in it. So I have to ask, who takes off their helmets on a foreign planet without at least testing the atmosphere for xenomorphic parasites? Not these guys. Sometimes the things producers say to us make a lot of sense, and we need to listen, especially if it will prevent us from contracting horrible alien diseases. And then the second moment of genius in Ridley's movie, it's near the end of the film, and everyone is dead, as you all expected, except the female doctor we just met and Miss Vickers. The world has gone to absolute hell, and they are all that remain of their original team. So again, imagine Miss Vickers is the producer, and the doctor is the game designer. This clip gives me the same feeling that I have when I get to the end of a very long project and it's a gigantic broken thing, and I feel utterly alone and abandoned, which I suppose is actually fairly normal and common, unfortunately. I'd like to point out that when her sole surviving creative team member tripped and fell and cried out, if Miss Vickers or the producer had just run to help her, she would have not been crushed by a gigantic broken spaceship. But instead, much like many producers on many projects in the games industry, this particular producer clung to their preset course, running straight ahead, and gave the needs of the creatives no attention. And of course, to which I can only say, well done, Miss Vickers, well done. To say that creative leaders have a powerful ego is not surprising. You probably picked up on it. To build a successful team, a successful game team demands obsessive effort. Holidays, spare time, interests, spouses, children, and sleep are all sacrificed to making the game. The driving ego, which identifies itself with the success or failure of the game, is much stronger than the urge to draw a paycheck or a sense of duty. The primary fuel for the ego is recognition, a kind of vanity which seems to be arrogance at first, but is in fact not really hard to injure or wound. It also seems to go with a mild to strong persecution complex, a feeling that those who are not completely won over by the creatives are enemies, united by a personal animosity in a deadly conspiracy. But that's just being a creative person, and producers often don't understand that. Sade said this about the creative force. If the principle of movement is inherent in nature, if nature is able by reason of her energy to conceive, create, manufacture, and maintain the multitudinous forces now in existence, a feat which certainly deserves all our admiration, then we don't need a foreign agent. The active creative faculty exists in nature itself. God is superfluous. This is why creatives don't feel like they need a lot of governance. If they embrace the creative force that's within them, that nature has given them, they will work passionately, diligently, and tirelessly towards its realization. Imposing governance in the form of a bad producer prince is antithetical to the creative force itself and is the source of most problems on a development team. When bad producers discourage this sort of motivation and they do not feed the creative ego, they are murdering countless brilliant games before those games are born. They are, by oppressing the creatives on the team, the creatives that could build the next major franchise, and they're ensuring that their own potential will be perpetually limited as producers because short-term gains are not the foundations on which to build your career. Admittedly, this combination of egotism, vanity, selfishness, and desire for recognition, I'm talking about game developers, and speed at taking offense are not, of course, the most appealing characteristics in any human. Some creatives are more aware of these problems than others and control their outward symptoms, but make no mistake, suppression of a trait is not the elimination of that trait. And yes, very often these people collect a devoted group of people around them. One reason is their strong personal magnetism. Another is that they provide an objective or a purpose, the task of building something which most people find attractive and many find irresistible. They have their eye on a goal, and somehow those who work for them are given to feel that they are not just earning a salary, but somehow serving a cause. The bad producer prince wants all of that for himself, leaving the creative leader to look elsewhere to make his game. Creative leaders love and hate more readily than other people, but it all helps to drive them on to scorn delights and work long days back to back, day after day. According to John Milton, fame is the spur. The Romans recognized this when they awarded triumphs to their victorious generals. The general would lead his soldiers through the streets, followed by a great train of captives and the spoils of war, up to the triumphal arch dedicated to him forever. An exhausted general who might be withering in the Libyan heat only had to close his eyes and imagine the adulation on the faces of the cheering crowd when he returned home victorious, and he would redouble his efforts, not for Rome, but for personal glory. This desire for public acclaim is not well satisfied in the games industry. We may see a few magazine articles and perhaps a small following among fans, but both of these are actually discouraged by game companies, or very often. Seriously, when was the last time a game designer received a statue? I don't have a statue. Machiavelli says that men are at all times ungrateful, fickle, feigners, and disassemblers, avoiders of danger, eager for gain, so that any ruler who has relied completely on promises and has neglected to prepare other defenses will be ruined. What Machiavelli said is that most people pursue their own interests and must be governed with an iron fist or through duplicitous means, and that to treat them otherwise will bring the prince to ruin because he will ultimately be betrayed. Machiavelli also says that every moment of every day, a wise prince should have no other objective and no other concern than war and its methods and practices. This is very different from what we do as creatives. It's very difficult for us to understand this particular perspective. And when I read it, it came as a total surprise to me. By and large, as creatives, we just want to be left alone to make art, to animate, to program, or to design. The only games we're concerned with are the ones that will entertain the most people, our fans. We don't really have time to play any political games. And if we take the time out of necessity, whether for self-preservation or to ensure that our game gets made, then we are not giving the best effort that fans deserve. And if the game isn't as good as we can make it, then it doesn't deserve to sell as well as our publisher would like. Excuse me. Political games, for the most part, are games we as creatives are destined to lose. Who is better at them? The producer prince who is paid to pursue these games full-time, or the creative who is nominally paid to create entertainment? So the reason the bad producer prince is always at war and preparing for war is the pursuit of power. Power holds diverse and conflicting ideas together, and somebody has to do this. Power gives direction to the random impulses of the individual members of the team. Again, someone has to do this. Power is the vital force of all organizations, and that's okay. Power is present within every game development team, and power you do not take for yourself as a creative will be taken by someone else, most likely your opponent. If you think that power should be used for good, it's your responsibility to take the most of it as possible. But when the bad take power and use it in unpleasant ways, whether knowingly or with cunning, that is when naive game developers are in the most danger. Machiavelli's insights inform virtually every important management topic. His writing was deemed so dangerous that his books were banned for hundreds of years, and during the Inquisition, recommended for total destruction. His original readers were so shocked by his philosophy, they denounced him as the invention of the devil, or even as the devil himself. And I never thought I would be in favor of banning any book, but I admit that maybe this time the church had the right idea. This guy was dangerous. But now, just as bad producers read Machiavelli or act as natural-born princes, so should you as game developers. And the Marquis de Sade had some things to say about how creatives should behave as well. Today, the Roman emperors Machiavelli studied have been replaced by CEOs and studio heads, the princes by producers, and the kingdoms and states by game development teams. Today, battles for life and death have been replaced by terminations, reorganizations, ramp downs, and backroom deals. What princes did in history, producers do today. Planning, organizing, directing, and controlling at all levels of management, gaining and maintaining armies, sustaining losses, and conquering the enemy in the name of what the conqueror, the producer prince, decides is right. The typical organizational structure of a large game company today is a perpetuation of what the city-states that Machiavelli studied. While it works for the princes who run it, it is not well suited for nurturing innovative, award-winning, or even worthwhile games among creative teams, which is not to say that these things are not achieved within this structure, merely in spite of them. A typical large game studio may have more or less the following hierarchy. On the bottom are support teams such as test, tech, and other departments in the company. These guys are about as far away from being princes as you can get. Next is the development team. These guys are also not princes and are primarily concerned with making stuff. Above them, we find the leads. They know who the princes are and do not want to be them at any cost. They have actual work to do. After the leads, we see the associate producers and project managers who don't actually make anything except spreadsheets. These are the proto-princes. And next, the senior producers. These are the princes in waiting for a position to open. And finally, on top of the pile sits the producer. He's the prince. I think Machiavelli would agree with me when I say that visibility on what princes do is progressively diminished the further down the pyramid you go, which is to say that the development team usually has no insight at all as to what bad princes are doing until it is being done to them. To developers, princes are always in meetings from which they often emerge with decrees. And these decrees are frequently change the team's priorities, invalidate work they've been focused on for weeks, and generally make no sense because they clearly have no consideration for what the vision and direction of the project is. While the development team has no idea what the bad princes are doing, the bad princes have no idea what the development team is doing, or perhaps they do not care. And most importantly, the producer prince is master of all he surveys and feels justified in wielding his power. After all, this is the way it has been done for thousands of years. But there's more to the corporate hierarchy. The producer prince reports directly to an executive producer prince who is even more removed from the day-to-day business of making games since he has very important work to do. This includes criticizing the efforts of the team, who always seems to be changing their minds about the vision and the direction of the game. He wants to know why priorities have changed and work that the team focused on for weeks has been thrown away, though he already suspects it is the game designer's fault. The other princes of the studio executives, ask a lot of diagnostic questions about the status of the project. In meetings with the producer prince, there's a lot of hand-waving and posturing through which the princes of the studio remind everyone that they once shipped a game on Univac, or they read an article about Zynga last month. At some point, the advisors to the executive tribunal may offer their opinions on a game project, but more often than not, they keep doing whatever it is that they were already doing. No one is really sure what goes on at this level of the pyramid, and it's best not to speculate. And finally, at the top, the emperors, the marketing president, the company president, and the chief creative officer. The executive tribunal receives news about one principality in their empire, in this case the team making the game, and they only receive it sporadically. There's usually a formal gathering once or twice a year in which representatives from the development team meet the tribunal in person to update them on the project. Usually 80% of the team attending the presentation consists of princes of one type or another, plus one creative to once again evangelize the vision that the team may or may not actually be working on. This is a show, and if performed properly, the tribunal is pleased and the status quo on the project is maintained. Regardless of whatever form the truth about the project has taken to get through this gauntlet of princely approvals, the truth has been delivered. So where does the creative director fit in? He is held responsible for the quality of the final shipped game, but he does not appear in the organizational pyramid because he has no power to speak of, and he's often viewed as a consultant whose opinions may or may not be heeded, as is useful to the many princes. The ability of a creative director to get anything done, anything meaningful done on this project, can be viewed by princes as a threat, and they do their utmost to either eliminate or subdue the threat to their power, as is natural. So the organizational period from a creative director's perspective can look something like this. For the creative people on or near the bottom and having no power, but all the responsibility for the game, this structure is often extremely unpleasant. What I find remarkable is not that the structure itself is frequently antithetical to building and maintaining inspiration and morale across development teams, but that princes often either cannot see from the perspective of their subordinates, or they do, and they think, hey, this power structure is actually working pretty well for me, so let's just go with it. When a young game designer who wants to one day be a creative director comes to me for advice about how to proceed, I don't have the heart to tell him that after all of his hard work, he's going to find himself at the bottom. I tell him to just study Dante's Hierarchy of Hell. His journey is going to be a lot like that. It's difficult because we expect honorable behavior from the people we work with, but that's a naive expectation oftentimes. According to Cicero and Plato, the cardinal virtues were wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, and honesty. Most people have a hard time embracing even one of those virtues full-time, and Machiavelli just says, to hell with all of those, except maybe wisdom, and wisdom is actually overrated. He says that any attempt to cultivate these princely virtues is a ruinously irrational policy. In order to maintain his power, the prince will often be forced by necessity to act treacherously, ruthlessly, or inhumanely. So here's the prototypical book on management, telling people to not use wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, or honesty. And we wonder, why do we have this funny feeling about being oppressed when we go to work? So as a creative, even when your promises are true and backed by the full force of your effort, the job of the prince is actually to disbelieve you and to behave like he doesn't trust you. This is the opposite of everything I ever believed about the producer and creative relationship, but it does put some things in perspective. How many times had I naively trusted that my honesty and motivation was precisely mirrored in my producer prints when the exact opposite was really true? The realization was staggering. I think one way, they think another. I wasn't sure if either way was truly wrong. Bad producer princes know naturally, or they have read Machiavelli, that it is much safer to be feared than loved. And Machiavelli said that if you make yourself feared, they will hesitate to offend or injure you. As a result, you will find it much easier to maintain your state. Criticisms of a prince with vices are taken in stride. A wise prince should not be troubled about becoming notorious for those vices without which it is difficult to preserve his power. Something about this seemed really biblical to me, the Old Testament in particular. There was a whole lot of smiting going on in the Old Testament, and fear of smiting is actually a pretty good deterrent for undesirable behavior. So thinking about all of this together reminded me of the behavior of a bad prince back in the early 90s. The producer of a team in my studio regularly snorted cocaine right off the desks of his office, and he encouraged his team members to do the same thing. I was completely scandalized because I was fresh off the boat from Mississippi, where I started, and I couldn't believe that this behavior was allowed to continue when the whole studio knew about it. And years later, I learned that the producer prince in question had really high-level connections in Hollywood that could have been useful to the studio in the future. And the fear of losing or negatively influencing those connections gave the prince the power to behave any way he saw fit. His game never shipped, by the way. And at this point, my reverie was interrupted because I was live and on the air with Sade and Machiavelli. You're on the air with the Marquis de Sade and Niccolo Machiavelli. Our caller is David, a veteran of the defunct video game industry. What's your question, caller? I want to know why people don't play games anymore. Machiavelli says, certainly they play games. Games are the fundamental mechanisms of government and the workplace. And Sade says, I would suppose it's because they're having orgies, or I would hope. Maybe the better question for you is why no one makes games anymore. Sade says, that's easy enough. It's the ultimate realization of my colleague's misguided philosophy. Machiavelli, I merely observed and recorded the success of the great princes of history. Over thousands of years, success does not make something just or right or even entertaining. Your advice resulted in the imprisonment or exile of countless creative personalities. What do you have to say about that, Machiavelli? I only regret that I never received another government position worthy of my intellect. So what do you think drove people away? And I knew this was a loaded question. Sade makes it clear. Within a Machiavellian power paradigm, the creative force does not thrive. It merely survives at best. Machiavelli, admittedly, my observances were for the prince whose goals were security, glory, and power. So not for creative people, not for making art. I cannot disagree, though great art was made, often commissioned by princes. But were those artists controlled by a producer? No, they were not. Is it fair to say they were at liberty to create the best work of which they were capable and that they were well compensated for this visionary effort? Yes, it is true. After agreeing upon the guidelines for the work, the artist was free to pursue it in the manner best fitting his skills. Michelangelo exchanged more than 50 letters with Giuliani de Medici before beginning work on his tomb. And after that, he just worked. So when there was too much control placed on the creatives in the games industry, when they were meddled with and badgered too often, what occurred? They left. Yes, to sell shoes or to make lattes or anything that didn't actually require passion. Well, they might have stayed. Games industry creatives exhibited lamentable misconception about their status and their position. And what was that? If you are not a producer prince, it is then that you need to understand not the art of management, but the art of survival. The activities of organizations are ambiguous and often threatening. Indeed, they are difficult to comprehend and impossible to conquer without at least a modicum of understanding of their nature and purpose. Therefore, the more you understand, the less dangerous the organization and organizations you interact with can become to you. The better you understand the rules, the better you can do battle. It is the fault of the creatives for not understanding the nature of their environments? Sade wants to know. Machiavelli, yes. Would you say then that creatives have much to learn from your observations? Indeed, yes. Very good. Then allow me to say, as you so aptly pointed out, those who create excess power for themselves often do so at their peril. As you said in the discourses, if the history of the Roman emperors was carefully studied, it would prove an ample guide to any producer and serve to show him that the way to glory or to infamy, to security or to perpetual apprehension. For the 26 that reigned from the time of Caesar to that of Maximinus, 16 were assassinated and only 10 died a natural death. So in the end, bad producer princes were driven out of the games industry because their behavior was so unacceptable that their teams turned on them. Perhaps that happened, but beware of conspiracies. Few can venture to make open war upon their sovereign, while everyone may engage in conspiracies against him. On the other hand, subjects cannot undertake more perilous and foolhardy enterprises than conspiracies, which are in every respect most difficult and dangerous. And so it is that, though so often attempted, yet they so rarely attain the desired object. Conspiracies almost always fail. Too true. That is why creatives should plot rather than conspire. I covered plots in the discourses. A plot may be formed by a single individual. The one cannot be called a conspiracy, but rather a determined purpose on the part of one man. He runs no risk, for as not one possesses his secret, there is no danger of his purpose coming to the ears of another. He cannot be found out. Though it pains me to say it, a selfless man with nothing to lose and being on a mission is a bad producer prince's worst nightmare. He is free to wait for his moment and then strike when the prince is weakest. This is delightful. But have a care. If the crusader has given any sign that he is malcontented, the producer prince will have warned his superiors in the company that the crusader is of bad character, difficult to manage, and unworthy. Those the crusader believes he will satisfy by acting selflessly will be offended and seek justice by his destruction. This is wonderful. The system of oppression perpetuates itself. This reminds me of a passage from my novel, Justine. The characters Justine and Rosalie have just witnessed horrific abuses of children, and Justine proposes that they run to the police to tell the story. Rosalie says, "Surely you jest. Do you think the police would accept the testimony of a pair of adolescents against the word of one of the most highly respected surgeons in France?" Justine says, "True justice can never be done, for the worst offenders are those esteemed most highly by the judiciary. Life has always been thus." So, Nicolo, you have illustrated the mechanisms by which good creatives were driven away from game companies, and on occasion how a bad prince might be driven out as well. But how do you account for the fall of the other game companies that were populated with what we both can agree, though distastefully, by good people? Why, my good Marquis, it should be obvious. Assholes breed like rabbits. I knew this much was true. Research shows that most people doing the recruiting tend to hire people that look and act like themselves. Harvard Business School professor Rosabeth Moss-Cantor called this homosocial reproduction, meaning that the hiring process causes most organizations to bring in clones of the staff they already have. The implication is that if there's a single asshole in a position to hire new staff, he will hire other assholes. A huge body of research, hundreds of studies, shows that when people are put in positions of power, they are often blinded to the fact they are acting like dickheads. And the same research shows that when you work with a jerk, his bad behavior can rub off on you like a venereal disease. You can literally catch the disease of being an asshole. If you thought I was horrified earlier, when I discovered this, I was really worried. This reminds me of a story a former colleague once told me. It was my first gig as a game designer, and I was really thrilled to be working on a cool IP, but the producer had high hopes of becoming a creative director himself, so he refused to hire or promote one from the team and instead assumed the role of CD for himself, informally. One morning he comes to me and he says, "I need you to come up with a game mode before lunch." It was 10:15 a.m. Being a new designer and eager to please, I didn't question the order, and I did my best. At 11:30, I was called into a meeting. I had a Word document that was not well organized and was difficult to read. I saw that my producer was sitting at the head of the table with designers from a partner studio, our executive producer, and an assortment of lead programmers from the game team. He started reading the document in front of everyone. I was embarrassed because it was not at the level of quality I require from myself. At some point, he stood up, gave me an evil look, and he screamed, "This is shit." He threw the document on the ground and told me how I had wasted everyone's time. He apologized to the room, saying that I did not do what I was supposed to do and that his vision was actually rock solid. He said I was a stupid newbie who had no idea how to make a design document based on his vision. I had been given no information on what he wanted. This was my first time that I was thrown under the bus by a producer, and I felt so horrible I nearly quit my job that day. The funny part, though, is that rushed, incomplete game mode I came up with in under an hour is still being played in the brand. The same designer went on to lead a very successful franchise, hailed for its innovation, and that made his company many millions of dollars. But he came very close to leaving the industry that day and going to work in an electronics store. How wonderful! Such cruelty is always sweeter when the victim is naive and cannot see it coming. How did that producer Prince get away with it? As I said in The Prince, everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know you for what you are. And those few who do know you dare not oppose the opinion of the prince, who has the majesty and power of the state or the company to defend them. So by dint of position and the need for a scapegoat, the producer prince manufactured the situation entirely. Extraordinary. Not so extraordinary. There have been many more remarkable examples of power in action. In 1502, when the people of Romagna voiced outrage at the oppressive methods used by Borgia's lieutenant Romero d'Orco in pacifying the province the previous year, Borgia knew exactly what to do. Romero had merely executed the Duke's orders and had done so successfully, transforming the area from chaos to sound government. But his cruelty had stirred up so much hatred that the continuing stability of the province was now in jeopardy. So Borgia summoned Romero to Imola, and 4 days later, Romero was found in the public square, cut into two pieces, so that the entire populace was able to see it. It was the pleasure of the Duke to show that he can make and unmake men as he wants. Well, he sounds like a lot of fun. Borgia was the figure whom you found most instructive on how to conduct oneself in political matters and war, was he not? He was. Are you saying that princes should emulate the Borgias? And I was totally speechless. Well, recover your tongue, Sade says. You tell the most exquisite, horrific stories. Give us another. Well, one acquaintance related his experience about being on a large team that had seen lots of upheaval. The producer sent mixed messages about the project status, laid off half the team, and isolated the team from its creative director. The creative director was responsible for communicating the vision for the project, but he was not even allowed to talk to the team making the game. No one knew why, because his vision was strong. The producer began to make creative decisions ad hoc. He created a climate of fear, disinformation, and uncertainty, especially once the team began to realize that half of the things this producer said were untrue. Later, he denied that the creative director had been forbidden to speak to the team and blamed the director for not doing so. Spreading confusion is actually part of the arsenal of any successful prince. As I noted in The Prince, the practice of hypocrisy is not merely indispensable in princely government, but is capable of being sustained without much difficulty or effort for as long as is required. But by the time creatives realize what's happening, the train is already wrecked. With a bad producer prince, I suppose this is true. That reminds me of another incident another colleague shared with me. Late on a Thursday afternoon, the art team was looking forward to a long holiday weekend. That's when my producer told me that I had to create a fake screenshot for the game to show what next-gen graphics would look like. And I only had the weekend to do it. I told him I don't like the idea of asking the team to do overtime, especially on a holiday weekend, after we just got rid of half of the artists because the producer decided we didn't need them. But we buckled down and we did the work. We busted our asses and we never got a thank you. In fact, the producer doesn't even know the names of the artists who worked on the image because he never talks to anyone below the producer level. And despite me constantly asking for news about how this fake screenshot was received, I never heard anything. This was after some huge, urgent rush to show something to the bigwigs to distract them from the fact that there was no progress on the rest of the game. And finally, when I asked in the leads meeting, the producer told me it was well received, but they didn't spend much time on it. I was pretty disgusted, but this was only one of many reasons that I quit the company. It turns out that the producer never actually showed the screenshots to anyone. All the work was for nothing, and he was perfectly comfortable lying to my face about it in front of everyone. This really gave me insight into how he thinks of people, especially those he is supposed to be working closely with. He has no respect for the team, and so he gets none of mine either. I knew I had made the right decision to get out, and that very talented artist, leader, and industry veteran with 12 years of experience walked out the door of that studio and went to a competitor, and he was far from the last person to leave that project. Machiavelli says, "The prince lies when necessary. The truth is your servant, not your master. There are other artists to be had in the world. What might be a lie to other men is to the prince simply one more aspect of his right to control the environment in which he operates. In this case, the producer prince thought that the screenshot would achieve some purpose that his subordinates could not comprehend. Subordinates were not given the full information about the reasons for needing a screenshot, reasons that might have easily been seen as flimsy or simply wrong. Won't all this lying catch up to the prince eventually? When you have enough power, everything you say is true, simply because you say it. As Richard Nixon said candidly to David Frost, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. Lying for a good business reason has become so prevalent that we have a term for it, positioning. When caught in a lie, deny, deny, deny. The key to success is to believe the lies you tell. This conveys a powerful sense of conviction and makes weak people trust you. Remember that it is the circumstances of the prince that are important, not the circumstances of those who serve him. In The Prince, I stated that no prince was ever at a loss for plausible reasons to cloak a breach of faith, but men are so simple that he who wishes to deceive will never fail in finding willing dupes. What's amazing about what Machiavelli just said is that most of us were taught to tell the truth, and that to not tell the truth would bring dire consequences. But following what Machiavelli says, this is why bad producer princes can guiltlessly deny any responsibility, forget that they told us to do something a certain way that they now hate, forget that they never promised any work from home days or time off or for overtime on weekends, or that you will get a promotion, staying instead, you're not ready yet, after you have sacrificed your personal life to work towards that goal. It is one reason talking to producers can be so infuriating, and one reason they can get away with being incompetent in all other things. For if they excel at denial and lying, they are just behaving in the manner of successful princes. And history has proven this is an actual winning tactic. I think you're getting it now. But this behavior drives many creatives away from otherwise very good game companies. Well, let's not demonize turnover, Sade says. Why, I've commented on this before in my novel, Justine. Justine is on her knees, begging before the character of Dubourg, and she says, "But sir, if everyone felt like you, all the poor people of this country would be left to die in the streets." And Dubourg says, "Is that so bad? France has more than enough subjects at the present time in view of the human mechanism's elasticity and propensity to reproduce. There's no real reason to fear depopulating the place." What Dubourg is saying is that producer princes shouldn't worry. They're going to find someone else to replace you. We'll make more. So we're all expendable. Of course, you serve at the pleasure of the prince, after all. But isn't lying and scapegoating a form of bullying? Along with all the other bad behaviors such as glowering, backstabbing, shouting, belittling, intimidation, and worse? I should say so, but the only crime in that is that the prince isn't using an actual whip to inflict his damage. And of course, there's no sex. Did you know that a 2002 study of workplace aggression and bullying in the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs surveyed nearly 5,000 employees about exposure to negative workplace behaviors? 36% reported persistent hostility from coworkers and supervisors, which meant experiencing at least one aggressive behavior at least weekly for a period of a year. Nearly 20% of employees in the same sample reported being bothered moderately to a great deal by abusive and aggressive behaviors, including yelling, tantrums, put-downs, glaring, exclusion, and malicious gossip. Research summarized by Charlotte Rayner in the UK suggests that about 25% of bullied victims and 20% of the witnesses of that bullying quit their jobs. Oh, sweet Satan, he has statistics. course I do. Rayner goes on to estimate that the average bullying rate in the UK is 15%. So in a company of approximately 1,000 people, if 25% of the bullied people and 20% of the witnesses to that bullying leave, and the cost of replacing a person through HR is about $20,000, then the cost of allowing a bad producer prince to run amok is approximately $750,000 a year. That's enough to ship an amazing mobile title, absolutely amazing, or fund a first playable for an independent studio, which is, by the way, where a lot of those dissatisfied employees went. They went independent. This is just the cost of the replacements. It doesn't factor in the cost of diminished productivity that results from oppressive or incomprehensible management. The study shows that an abusive workplace causes a staggering array of problems for employees, and it affects their friends and families too. Based on what I have heard here tonight, you and your so-called creatives need to develop a thicker skin. Consider this. You must first know that there are two ways of contesting, the one by law and the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second proper to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse to the second. Achilles and other princes of old were given to the centaur Chiron to nurse, who brought them up in his discipline, which means that as they had for a teacher one who was half beast and half man, so it is necessary for a prince to know how to make use of both natures, and that one without the other is not durable. I think it's tragic that so many creatives who were outsiders and nerds as kids grew up and thought that they had found an industry that would include them and reward them for their talents and skills and passion that had made them victims when they were younger. When they attempted to do what they loved, they found themselves right back on the playground again. As victims of bullying, we rarely learn to fight. It is often not in our nature, as many of us are not aggressive people. Yet rather than treating this tendency with great care and consideration, bad producer princes are chosen and tacitly encouraged to control, intimidate, and make miserable the very people who make the games that generate income for their companies. You were complaining that you were not raised by centaurs? Figuratively speaking, of course. Let me give you some advice. A prince, therefore being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be the fox to discover the snares, and the lion to terrify the wolves. And by extension, creatives need to have the same good qualities, and that they should cultivate both the fox and the lion within themselves. I suppose this is so. Delicious. Do you see, caller, how we are subverting the insights of Machiavelli himself? You're saying that creatives should build the power of their own and be willing to test their power when the opportunity arises? Absolutely. There is altogether not enough wickedness in this world. Simply think of what you would normally do and then do the opposite. You will quickly build power all your own. I guess I'm just not wired that way, but it reminds me of another story. At first, when senior management insisted that I collaborate with a film director from outside the company, I was apprehensive. I already had enough meddling to contend with in the company. But the director reviewed and validated my game's story and helped make it better. This was a huge success for us. But months later, my team had a new producer forced on us. And this producer flouted the importance of consulting with a top-grossing film director on the story for my game. This producer told me that the director was awful. This was in direct contradiction to the opinion of the studio that the studio had of the director, and the story had already been approved by the executive tribunal. I was so flummoxed I didn't say anything, and at the time I was simply fearful for my job. And what might you have said, knowing now that the prince must act boldly and swiftly? Stick to managing the budget and the schedule, you arrogant, ignorant troglodyte. And I wish I had. There's the spirit. And what else? Inform the creative officer that the new producer was acting in a counterproductive manner by creating needless work and at the same time undermining his authority? That would certainly have done something and made you a target as well. But you would have felt so alive. And remember that any creative worth his art must be willing to take a stand. Do you have any more anecdotes? Well, I once left a project because the producer filed all my directors, all of my direct reports. My support team was gone. They were all super qualified and motivated guys. They believed in the vision of the project. I suppose that in your philosophy, they had to go in order for the producer to build their power and to diminish my own. By the time that producer was finished with us, all that was left of my team was the word Croatoan on a Post-it note. I would approve of this tactic. And of course you would, Machiavelli. It's just business from the perspective of the prince. But the teams left behind without leads they knew and respected were traumatized. And what would your statistics say about that, caller? It's simple. According to research by Miner, Glom, and Hewlin, negative interactions have 5 times the effect of positive ones. Imagine being on a team managed by a bad producer prince for several years. After all those negative interactions, do you think anyone could resurrect morale? Negative interactions have 5 times the effect of positive ones. How remarkably efficient. Could any team hope to recover when the odds are so clearly stacked against them? Perhaps not. But the prince did maintain his principality at the cost of his team, who were no doubt getting paid, were they not? Of course. Let me be clear. I have no illusions that work should be fun. This is a contradictory statement. Fun is the result of play. The result of work is satisfaction. The result of bad work is dissatisfaction. If you enjoy your work because it provides a sense of satisfaction, you enjoy your work because it provides satisfaction, not fun. You do not have the right to have fun at work, but you do have a right to be satisfied with your work. The hardest thing for me to understand is not why I was not having fun, but how the creative spark that drove me to bring passion and diligence to my work was always in jeopardy of being extinguished. A point well made. I do not disagree. You do not have the right to anything unless you are the prince. So in the Machiavellian workplace, you have 2 choices. Practice indifference or use Machiavellian tactics to improve your status. I have been saying as much for years. If you paid any attention whatsoever to what I wrote in my play, Politics in the Bedroom, you will recall the words of established libertine Dolmance to her pupil Eugenie. There is great wisdom in an economy of feeling towards others. Why should we concern ourselves with cares that are not ours? Besides, apathy is fun. Ideally, of course, one could perpetuate only evil, but since this is not always possible, there remains still the piquant wickedness of never doing any good. So to creatives, I say, take pleasure where you find it, and to hell with the rest of it. Use Machiavellian tactics wherever they seem appropriate. They can be quite exciting. As I put forward in my libertine novel, Justine, we are all headed toward death anyway, and in the graveyard, virtue and vice are indistinguishable. Do you think that our survivors will care whether we lived a virtuous life? By then, the meaning of virtue will probably have changed anyway, so it's not worth worrying about. The poor dolt who passes his life as a stranger to joy dies unrewarded. That's worth considering, but what can a creative do to prepare to become a libertine? I think we've covered that in a cursory manner. And I think I have a pamphlet here. Yes, take this and keep it close to your black heart. You will be a true libertine in no time. I am experiencing disquiet. Oh, shut up, Nicolo. You are just the death of the party. Don't you know that? Stay tuned, everyone. The Steve Jobs show is next. And I checked my email. Sure enough, Sade's pamphlet is waiting there. As promised, I read the title, The Libertine Survival Guide for the Postmodern Workplace, or The Wicked Shall Inherit Everything. From the introduction, you have been singled out because you cooperate and collaborate with others. You are considerate and honest. You go about minding your own business, staying focused on your tasks, and doing what you believe is best for your team. You will therefore be beaten down in an attempt to reduce your capacity. You can survive contact with a toxic prince until it has destroyed your confidence, diminished your capacity, and caused a host of physical and mental health problems, and this book will show you how. I don't have time to read the whole pamphlet today, so I'll repost it. I'm reminded of what Machiavelli said in the Discourses. This, then, is a sign of virtue in rules and citizens alike. Each must be prepared to advance not his own interests, but the general good, not his own posterity, but the common fatherland. Do as Rome and be an enemy to the name of king and lover of the glory and the common good of your native city. He proposes that a corrupt constitution is a constitution in which only the powerful are able to propose actions and do so not for the common liberty, but for their own power. But if your city can't be saved, you may have to start your own. Creative leaders should read both Machiavelli and Marquis de Sade and be empowered to fight fire with fire. When people say that an absolute dictatorship carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, what they really mean is that it does not carry within it the seeds of its own survival. Authority plus responsibility is equal to power. This is healthy and should be the goal of any organizational structure predicated on making games. Authority without responsibility is deposition. This is unfortunately what we see happen in many game companies today, wherein creative teams pay the price for producer decisions. Finally, responsibility without authority is what it's like to be a creative lead. And most unfortunate, this is where a lot of creatives stand today. At one company I worked for, all of the project leads were called, and directors were jokingly referred to as senior level suggesters. As for me, I can't look at anything without seeing it through the lens of Machiavelli and Marquis de Sade now. Be aware that your purpose may be misaligned with that of your managers and those in charge. Don't hate them because they appear to have counter purposes to yours. Realize that it is in their natures. Don't hate them, outthink them. You can embrace apathy and hope for the best. You may never ship a game of any merit and will rely on the dubious and perhaps rare goodwill of producers and executives. Or you can, to some degree, become a prince yourself. Remember that any game worth making is worth fighting for, and to get it made, you may indeed have to fight, and fight in ways that seem counterproductive or alien to you. But as game designers, programmers, and artists, you are all uncommonly smart and talented. You'll probably find that you have a flair for Machiavellian tactics. But proceed with caution. When setting out to find or forge your own kingdom, and you dabble in Machiavellian strategies, you have to be careful. The temptation to become a prince yourself is sweet fruit, and one to which you can easily become addicted. Do not become entirely that which you abhor. Remember that these stories do not always have happy endings. Mutatis mutandis. With the things having been changed which need to be changed. Special thanks go out to all the many game developers who shared their stories with me, and apologies for not being able to use very many of them during the time allowed. You can follow the continuing dialogue of Sade and Machiavelli on my blog at softstudios.com, and all of the references I used in the presentation are listed there. And you can also see all of the slides that we didn't have time for on that website. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, David Sears of SOF Studios. And coming up shortly will be the Harp Twins. We will have them set up shortly. Thank you.